and welcome back to part 2 of the Power of Peer Support. We're going to be talking about problem solving and decision making, and also about working with institutions and focusing on some other skills that you can develop to help you in your practice as a peer support parent. My name is Kate. I'm with the Canadian Premature Babies Foundation, and I would urge you, as with the first half of this recorded webinar, if you want to do this with a buddy, it makes the exercises a lot easier, a lot more fun, and I think it helps you learn more if you're practicing it with somebody else. Now, we'll start off by talking about problem solving and decision making. And what we're not talking about solving problems for people or making decisions for people. The goal is to help parents in the NICU focus on their own problems and make their own decisions and solve their own problems. Because it's ultimately disempowering to have somebody come in, sweep in, and do things for you, although it can feel very nice, especially if they're doing your laundry or cooking your meals. But really, what we want to do as peer parents is help people feel like they have agency in their own lives and that they can do things to help themselves. It's a really wonderful feeling, especially if in other areas of your life you are feeling disempowered, you are feeling like you don't have any agency or control. So this is a 5-step problem-solving process, a decision-making process, and it can serve as a plan of action to help parents feel some sense of control, and it can help them make decisions. So, and this is something we can use ourselves, but we can certainly guide other people in going through these steps. So the first step is to identify the central issue or problem, right? To just figure out what exactly is it that's the problem. And then to explore it. And what we mean by exploring is put everything on the table. What are all the alternatives? What are all the things we could do? And what are some of the consequences of doing these particular things? So just kind of walking down, imagining what would it look like if I walked down this path, and what would it look like if I walked down that path? And then based on that discussion, choosing a next step. It could be a big step, it could be a small step, it doesn't really matter, but it's choosing something to do. The 4th step is to act on that choice, to actually carry out that step. And then the 5th step, and this is one that we often forget to do in our daily life, but it's really, really important, is to make time for evaluating the results, to figure out, was that the right choice? Did it work for me? And by making time to evaluate the results, what we're doing is we're making sure that we're going to learn from this process. And so that the next time we go through it, this will become more information that will help us make other choices. So this is the process that you want to help guide parents through. Again, you don't want to do it for them. You want them to do it for themselves with your support. So pair up with your buddy, and we're going to do an exercise. And you can pause the video once we've explained what the exercise is. But so you want to think of a problem that a parent in the NICU might experience. So some examples would be, I find it really scary to come to the NICU. A parent might have some ideas about, and I'll give you some of these examples in the next page, but they might have ideas about their baby's care that they're afraid to share with the nurse or with the team, and they might not know how to do that. So you're going to talk through those problems, go through the 5 stages, and then you're going to debrief with your partner. And during this role play, it really helps if you do it once with each of you playing one role, so one of you being the peer parent, the other being the current NICU parent, and then you do it again and you switch roles. And that way you both have the opportunity to learn. So these are some of the suggested problems, but you can come up with your own as well. I find it scary to go in the NICU. I hate pumping. How do you help an NICU mom manage that feeling? This last one's interesting because it's a lot of different problems all kind of rolled up together. So if you really want to dig into an interesting problem to solve or to help solve, this would be a good one because you have to figure out what is the real problem here and how do we focus on that, and then how do we pick out some helpful things for that family to do. So pair up, do your exercise, pause the video, and do take time to reflect on what you've learned from this before you start the video again, and we'll move on to talking about communication roadblocks. So now you've unpaused the video and we're back on track after you've done the exercise. Hope that was enjoyable for you. And we're going to talk about some communication roadblocks, so things that get in the way of communicating with NICU parents, or with anybody, to be honest. So these are ineffective ways of responding to somebody. They block the communication process. They don't facilitate it. The other person will feel judged judged or misunderstood, or they'll feel like you're not respecting them. And they'll probably not want to continue the conversation, or they'll feel defensive. And then the other thing that happens, and it's really easy to do this with NICU parents because they're feeling so vulnerable, people can lose confidence. So this first example, advising. And you might think, well, I'm there to give advice. And well, a little bit of gentle advice, that's one thing. But telling people what they should and shouldn't do, that's a real roadblock. Because the implication is that person can't make decisions for him or herself. And if you say something, for example, like you should be at the hospital more, that person might have a really good reason why they're not at the hospital. Or even if they don't have what you consider to be a good reason, it's a good reason for them. And so as soon as you say, well, you should be doing something differently, they might not feel comfortable talking to you about what those reasons are. And that ties in with the judgment. So if, this is something that NICU families talk about all the time with family members, people who say things like, well, what did you do to cause the early birth? And, why didn't you quit work earlier or whatever? Those judgmental comments, especially when somebody's in a state of crisis or vulnerability, they really shut down all potential communication because they make that person feel so unsafe. So you really have to watch this in your language with people. False reassurance. This is a really hard one because we all want to say, don't worry, your baby will be fine. And the likelihood is that that is true. Most NICU babies do really well. And the ones who have rough times, they can still come out of the NICU and lead amazing lives. And most NICU stories are happy stories, even if they are not the stories that the parents had expected when they first arrived in the NICU. But at the same time, we have our mission is always to be honest, and we cannot say anything that's not true, and we don't know if somebody's going to be fine or not. So false promises, that if we make false promises, we're promoting a lack of trust, and we're negating the reasonable worry that a parent in the NICU might feel. So we can't do that. We have to be really careful about that. Again, our goal is to promote realistic optimism. If we can't give reassurance about tomorrow, is there anything we can celebrate today? And that's a very positive way of looking at it. Avoiding or changing the subject. So if somebody says to you, I'm worried that my baby will never come home, and then you respond by saying, well, do you have the baby's room ready? You're not engaging with what they're really saying. And they're going to feel like either what they said was wrong, or like you aren't capable of dealing with it, or, they're not going to be able to, they're not going to feel a connection to you. So it's really important to just, even if it's an uncomfortable topic, to just be with them in that moment and do them the honor, really, of listening to what they actually have to say rather than forcing it into a discussion that you're more comfortable with. This fifth point is really important. We're going to dig into it a little bit more deeply later on, but interrupting the clinical trust relationship. We may not always understand what's going on with the baby's course of treatment or what's going on with the family, but if we get in the way of their relationships with other social workers or nurses or lactation consultants or doctors, that's not going to be helpful. So you really want to remember that you're part of a team, and your job is to, yes, it's to support that NICU parent, but it's also to support the other team members. Asking too many questions, number 6 here. Parents can start feeling, current NICU parents can start feeling like they're being interviewed if these questions are just being fired off one after another. Who, what, where, why, and a parent will end up losing track of his or her own feelings if we're pushing our agenda too fiercely on them. And then this last bit, and this is something that I do, and I'm not proud of it, and I'm trying to get better at it, that is rushing the conversation. And this happens because people are busy, and because you run into somebody and they present you with a big problem, and you actually only have 10 minutes where you can talk with them about it. And that's not ideal, because those conversations deserve more time. So what I've learned to do is, if I know it's going to be a big conversation and I really don't have the time right then, like I'm in the middle of doing something else or helping another family, I will book time with that family. I will say, this is important. I really want to sit down and hear your whole story. Can I come back at 3, for example? So I book the time, I make the time, and I'm able to give the conversation the respect that it deserves and the time that it deserves. Rushing it doesn't do anybody any good. It makes me as the peer parent feel kind of terrible, like I'm not doing my best job. And I think it makes the person at the other end of the conversation feel like they're not important, which is the last thing in the world we want them to feel. So here's a nice exercise to do. with your partner, discuss the types of communication roadblocks you experience, and this can be drawn from your regular life or your NICU experience, and what was your response to them? So, you can do this, conversations you've had with family members. This could be very cathartic, actually. And then talk the conversation through, and then think about how do you rewrite the conversation, make it more positive. So here's a couple of topics you could use: keeping your baby safe at home, managing pumping, or managing concerns about your child's development. So these are all big topics, and they're loaded topics to a lot of people. But see if you can experiment, getting into these conversations. You can try deliberately shutting the conversation down, and then you can see what that feels like. And then you can try deliberately opening it up again and see what that feels like. So once you finish this exercise, we're going to move on to talking about confidentiality and other social issues. So you finished your exercise, confidentiality and social issues. This is really, really important. And for those of you who are volunteering in the context of a hospital, usually you will be asked to go through a volunteer program, volunteer orientation, and that is a wonderful opportunity to learn about these issues in depth. Every hospital, every institution dealing with patients and families, they will have policies to deal with privacy, and it is in your best interest to know what those are and to learn about them. Generally speaking, wherever you're volunteering, whether you're doing this online or whether you're doing it informally, whether you're just offering support to somebody you meet in a baby group somewhere, I think it's in everyone's best interest for everybody always to respect privacy as if we were all working in a hospital. So protecting other people's personal information and not sharing stories of, so if I'm in working with a family and they tell me something, I might share it with somebody in their circle of care who can help them, but I'm not going to share any of their information, even happy, nice information. I'm not going to share any of their information with my friends, with colleagues who are not in the circle of care, with my family, with my spouse. It's not my information to share, and that's really, really important to remember. And it can be difficult sometimes because you meet these amazing people and you celebrate with them and you rejoice with them when they go home, when their baby graduates, and you do want to share, but you have to remember that it is not your story to share. Now, dealing with conflict. I haven't had any instances that I can remember where parents have been angry with me. I have had parents disclose their feelings of anger with other people, with other parents, with other family members, with staff members, and this can be very challenging. It's very normal to want to agree and to bond over similarly challenging experiences. But you have to remember that encouraging anger can actually cause harm to the parent you're trying to support, because it can be disruptive of a trust relationship that's actually necessary to that parent right then. So you can listen and you can sympathize or empathize with their feelings, but you don't need to validate the feelings or agree with them or pump them up. So for example, you can say, that sounds like a really tough situation. What could we do to make it better? What do you think could make it better? Instead of, I know exactly what you mean, that doctor's horrible. Now, this next point, dealing with uncertainty. This, I think, is one of the most challenging parts of the NICU experience, is living with the uncertainty of what the future will hold. And it's very natural to want to encourage people and parents to think positively about the future, but it's equally vital that you focus on encouraging realistic optimism. And at times you may be wondering, why is the medical team pursuing this course of treatment? And you've got to remember that new practices and procedures are always being developed in the NICU, and you don't know the entirety of a baby's story or of a family's story. So if you start questioning decision making, you might be disrupting this trust relationship. And if you're concerned, you can speak with a member of the circle of care, a medical team member, and if there are legitimate concerns, they can address that issue. But you really want to be understanding that parent is particularly vulnerable, and you digging in and elevating the conflict or making that feeling of uncertainty worse, it's not going to help them. Sometimes the best way to manage uncertainty is to realize that uncertainty is hope. So if we don't know what's happening tomorrow, that means that there is potential for it to be positive as well as negative. And sometimes uncertainty in the NICU can be our greatest gift. Sometimes the things that we are most certain of are the most negative outcomes, or the outcomes that we're most afraid of. So helping people appreciate the benefit or the kind of silver lining to uncertainty, as it were, Sometimes that's something that you can do, again, depending on your relationship with the family. Understanding boundaries. This is huge. This is really difficult. It's one of those things that looks really easy on paper, but then I think is actually very hard to do in reality. You will be a vital resource for a family. You're not the only resource. And if a parent presents you with issues that you don't think you can solve, you reach out to a team member for help. Social workers, they're the hidden heroes of the NICU, and nurses who are champions and are guardian angels, and they can offer valuable support, and they can take the baton from you when the problems that you've been presented with exceed your comfort level or your knowledge level. And if you're ever in any doubt, reach out for help, connect with a relevant staff member. That's really, really important. Now, also respecting your own boundaries in terms of, I don't, while parents are in the NICU, I don't friend them on social media. I don't share my personal cell phone number with them because I need to respect that the relationship is something that's located in this institution. And I need to be careful about managing the impact of that relationship and how it might spill over into my personal life. So every institution has different rules about this, and it's really good to know what those social media rules or those contact rules might be in your institution. But I think this is another best practice that just works generally. Just making sure that you have a way of controlling or kind of making sure that your family life can stay apart from this. Because this work can really take up your entire life if you let it. And you need time to be you, and you need time to be with your family, and you need downtime from this work for sure. One thing I forgot, it kind of ties in with this last point, self-care. Really, really important. This is amazing work, but it can be emotional work, and it can be taxing work. It can bring back feelings like the worst feelings in the world of stress and worry. You'll get very attached to people, and sometimes bad things happen to these amazing people, and that is so hard. It's hard for them, and it's hard for you. So everyone will figure out their own ways of coping with this. Everyone will figure out their own rituals, their own support mechanisms. Counseling is invaluable. Therapy is wonderful. Talking with somebody, part of that circle of care, talking with a social worker at the NICU, for example, might be great. But figure out what works for you. Mindfulness practice might be very helpful to you, for example. But also feel, if this work is getting to you, if you're feeling stressed and anxious, never feel bad about taking a break from it, for taking a break from peer mentoring to focus on yourself and your family and your own needs. Now, I keep on coming back to this topic, but I think it's so important. And this comes up if you're, regardless of it doesn't really matter how you're working with patients and families, whether you're working in a unit, whether you're doing stuff online, whether you're coming into a unit to do talks or to be part of events. If you remember that at the center of the circle of care is a vulnerable baby and a vulnerable family, and that everybody who's in that circle of care is dependent on each other to uphold that trust relationship. And you're part of that trust relationship now, so you have to protect it. And part of what this means is, or part of what I mean here is that every unit has its own culture. Every unit has its own key messages, let's say. So for example, in the unit where I work, one of the things that we're very serious about is providing breast milk. So we do everything we can to help moms make milk for their babies. We have donor milk. We do a lot of work in this regard. So if somebody wants to come in and we have a lot of peer mentors who come in and volunteer, and they're wonderful, but we want them to support these messages. We want them to support the information that we're giving out. They may or may not disagree with it. We have moms who've chosen to formula feed, and that's absolutely their choice, and we support them in it. But I would ask those mothers not to come in and purposefully say to parents, you can disregard all this information they're giving you about breast milk. I formula fed my baby, and it's just fine. And it may sound like I'm advocating censorship, but I'm not. What I'm saying is that if you're going to be like the public face, if you're doing a talk in the unit, make sure that you're aligned with those core messages, those key messages that unit is trying to promote. Because otherwise it can be very disconcerting and confusing for parents. It's like, okay, but so this person told me this, and the nurse told me this, and the peer parent told me this. That's not helpful for parents. And it does help you kind of, and we'll get into this more later, but if you want to volunteer in a unit but you don't agree with what they're doing, then being a peer parent there might not be the best choice for you. If you can't be part of the circle of care, and if you don't feel comfortable upholding the information, if you don't feel comfortable sharing the information that people want you to share and being part of that circle, then you might want to find other volunteer work to do. Now, Working with groups. So groups, peer support groups, this is a wonderful way of developing peer support. One-on-one peer support is fantastic. Groups are great if you don't have a lot of time, if you can visit a unit once a week or once a month, for example, if you want to do events. And this is wonderful because not only are you there providing peer support, but what you'll find is that the parents who come to the events end up supporting each other. So briefly, some quick tips. I mean, you could do a whole webinar just on running groups, but this is what we'll talk about for today. You got to promote them and then promote them some more and then promote them some more. At the same time, numbers aren't everything. So sometimes if you get 20 people to a group, I mean, it's great numbers, but you may not be able to have quality conversations because there's so many people. Whereas if you get 5 people together, you might be able to get some really great conversations going and people really feel connected to each other and they feel well supported. So you want to get, you don't want every group to have one person in it. That's not sustainable. But don't think that if you don't have a full house every time that it's not worth doing. If you get 4 or 5 people and they have a wonderful time at your group, that's fantastic. A co-hosted model is really best because this way, if something goes wrong, like if somebody gets really upset in the group, one of the hosts can deal with the person who's upset and the other person can keep the group going. A wonderful way to do these groups is to co-host with an NICU staff member. So I love it when I get a chance to co-host with a social worker, for example, or a nurse. But we also have another peer parent who co-hosts with me, and we have a tremendous time. We always have food. We kind of joke around that people will come for the pizza but stay for the conversation. But it is kind of, joking aside, it's kind of nice to have give people an excuse to come. If they're feeling uncomfortable with the idea of sharing, they might not feel uncomfortable with the idea of coming and grabbing a cookie. And then they still get that connection and that support that they might not even have known about, or they didn't even realize that that was something they were interested in until they experience it. You want to keep times very predictable, so that every Monday at 1 o'clock or the first Saturday of every month, just so that people have less information to remember. You want to start every meeting very strongly by setting a very positive tone and setting some ground rules so that we respect confidentiality, we don't talk about people who aren't in the room, that sort of thing. You might want to develop some icebreakers, asking people for the story of their baby's name. That's a great way of getting the conversational ball rolling. And then the other thing, and this is hard because you always feel like you want to use up all your time talking with people, but you really want to book appropriate time for setting the meeting up so it's all nice and organized when people come in, and closing it down and then debriefing with somebody afterwards so that if something comes up in the meeting and you're a little bit concerned about it, you always want to make sure you close that circle before you leave the hospital or institution where you're doing the group, so that you hand off to somebody. If you're worried about somebody, you talk to the social worker before you go. And that's really, really important. Now, when it comes to developing relationships, and this isn't really to do with where the peer support's happening. This can happen in so many different contexts, whether it's in hospitals or online. So we'll start by talking about letters or emails of introduction. So if you're writing a short letter that's going to be left at the bedside, for example, or delivered on your behalf, you want to do a very short introduction to your own story, maybe a little bit of info about your family or your baby, like your baby's weight, gestational age, or specific issues that you faced, what the experience meant for you, how you hope to be helpful to them, and then you always want to give them some sense of like what's going to happen next. So here's my contact information. Feel free to call me between this and this time, or email me between this and this time, for example. If you're emailing, same rules apply. You may want to create a separate email just for this work, just so that you can control it better. And again, protecting those regular life and volunteer life or peer support life, being able to protect the boundaries between those two groups of activities. With telephone tips, nobody seems to answer their phone anymore. So if you're phoning somebody, remember that often people with a baby in the NICU get very nervous when somebody phones them. So explain very quickly who you are. Call when you don't expect interruptions, so that if you have a few minutes without children at your feet, that's a really great time to call. And you might have to try a few different times a day, but really what you want to do is introduce yourself very quickly, ask if it's a good time to talk, and then if you do get a bit of a chat in, that's great, but then you close the conversation by saying what's going to happen next. And this is true when you're meeting in person as well. You don't want the parent thinking, What do I have to do next? You're going to make that really clear. This is what happens next. Now, when it comes to connecting online, there are all kinds. Again, we could do a whole separate webinar on offering support online. Research does show that online support groups can be really helpful to participants, especially to those who wouldn't find it easy to be at an in-person session. An online support group should be private but not anonymous. It should be moderated just to keep it safe and positive for everybody. There should be clear guidelines that are posted and visible and accessible to everybody. There should be active posters. If it's all lurkers, that's not very fun or entertaining for anyone. It should be a place of acceptance and not judgment, and a place of respectful sharing and not arguments. So you definitely want to be a part of that. It can be difficult when people post things that you don't agree with. If you're a moderator, you probably want to deal with that offline rather than posting something for the whole group to see. You want to move quickly because things can go toxic very quickly. And you also never really want to get into an online argument. It's really best to move things, to move swiftly, to remove messages that are troubling, and to connect with people by private message if you want to explain something to them or if you want to clarify something with them. Now, if we're talking about developing relationships with institutions, so you may be watching this and you may be interested in doing some peer mentorship, but you're not sure where to start. So a great way, if you have a history with an NICU, you can contact the volunteer services area at the hospital, or you could offer to organize events or celebrations at the unit. So something for World Prematurity Day, for example, on November 17th. You might say, I'd love to come in and organize a tea or cake and coffee and cookies or something like that. Doing celebrations for Halloween or Thanksgiving or Mother's Day or Father's Day. Those are all wonderful ways of starting to develop a relationship with an institution. Many NICUs have family advisory committees, and that can be wonderful. And you can get involved in all kinds of interesting projects, not just peer support work. One thing I'd like to spend a bit of time on is it's important for you to understand why you're coming back and what you want out of volunteering. So I find that when people are really focused on giving back, and they've had a particular kind of experience and they want to help another parent, those are people who are very well suited to peer mentor work. Now we've had other amazing volunteers who have maybe not, they've had a rockier time in the NICU, and their focus is that they want to make some change. They're not wrong, and that's not a bad focus, but it doesn't necessarily lend itself to peer mentoring, because again, they're more agenda driven. And the agenda is not supporting the current NICU family. The agenda is making sure a particular type of change happens. So again, that's not wrong. That can be wonderful. But peer mentoring, if that's what you're feeling, then peer mentoring is not really where you should be doing that kind of work. So it's really important to understand your motivation. Like, why do you want to come back and do this work? The other thing that's really interesting to understand is, are you ready? And I think it was the team at Moncton when they were doing family integrated care at Moncton, and they have a wonderful group of parents who volunteer and do peer support in the unit. And they sort of developed a bit of a readiness test for people where they would write out their stories, and then before you could volunteer in the unit, you would have to just come back and visit and do a bit of a reflection piece on what that felt like. And so some people realized, you know what? I love this place and I want to be involved in some way, but I'm not ready to do the peer mentorship yet. It doesn't feel right yet. And that is absolutely okay. To be able to do a self-readiness test and figure out that this is not the right time for you, that's nothing to be ashamed of. That's actually wonderful. So this is important. Before you get deep into this work, it's important to give yourself the time to figure out, is this the right time for me, and is this the right project for me? Now, so if you have figured out, yes, this is the right time, and yes, this is the right type of work for me to be doing, one really useful thing, and this is your last exercise of this webinar, is to develop your elevator story. So what I mean by that is you're riding in an elevator with somebody, so you've got like 1 to 2 minutes with them, that's it, and you have to share your story. So obviously you can't share all the data and everything that happened to you. You have to figure out 3 or 4 things that really matter and turn them into a story. Now when you're doing storytelling with a parent in the NICU, it's wonderful if you can be there, if you can ask them, tell me your birth story, and they can tell you all the data, they can tell you everything, because that can be very therapeutic for them. But when you're sharing your story, you want to keep it very, very short, because your story is serving a different purpose. Your story is helping them. Your story is helping them feel connected to you. So for the next exercise, with your buddy, each of you take a few minutes, think about your elevator story, think about what are the elements of my experience that really mattered to me, what would be useful for another parent to hear about, what should I be sharing, and practice it. And the reason you practice it is because you want to get really comfortable giving this so that you can, even if somebody is standing nearby and maybe overhearing you, you don't feel shy, you don't feel any discomfort, you can just get through the story. And it's a good thing to practice because sometimes the first couple times you tell your story, you can get very emotional, which is totally reasonable, makes a lot of sense. But you kind of want to work that out before you share it with a parent who's in the NICU. So practice your elevator story. You can pause the video for a little bit while you do that. And when you come back, we'll be signing off with a few more pieces of information. So you've unpaused the video and now you have completed your elevator story. There may be something you want to continue to practice. You may develop different flavors of your story depending on who you're talking to. I want to say thank you for your time and attention. I appreciate your interest in this work. I think we could always do with more peer support out there, so I wish you luck. If you want any more information, the Canadian Premature Babies Foundation, we've put a lot of time and energy into developing peer support resources. We have some handouts available. We have a peer support program where we're offering some financial support to units who want to start peer groups. So don't be shy, get in touch. You can visit our website to learn more. And that's all for now. Thanks again for your time and attention, and enjoy the time you spend peer supporting.